Some secrets don't die with us. They wait in the places we left behind, patient as stone. Tansy Reddin learned this truth at 62, standing in her grandfather's mountain cabin 3 weeks after they buried him. She's a widow, a former forest ranger with no children and few ties left. She came to clean out the old trapping cabin he'd abandoned before she was born, expecting nothing but dust and memories. Instead, she found the cabin strangely preserved, as if it had been waiting. In the center of the room sat 2 canvas-covered tables, arranged with careful intention. What she discovered beneath those covers stirred up a family secret no one had dared to speak, a decision her grandfather made decades ago that shaped her entire life. What could be so important that a man would hide it in the mountains for 40 years? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up into the Blue Pine Mountains took Tansy Reddin 4 hours from her small house in Pinecrest, though the cabin itself sat only 30 miles from town as the crow flies. The old logging road wound through dense forest, switchbacking up ridges that grew steeper with each passing mile. November had painted the aspens gold and stripped the oaks bare, leaving the evergreens to hold their silent watch over valleys that dropped away into blue shadow. Tansy kept both hands on the wheel of her pickup, feeling every rut and washout through the steering column. At 62, she still had the strength that came from decades of hiking trails and hauling equipment, but her joints complained more than they used to. The truck's heater blew warm air that smelled faintly of pine needles and old coffee. On the passenger seat sat a cardboard box containing cleaning supplies, trash bags, and a thermos of black coffee she'd brewed before dawn. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel Reddin's funeral. 3 weeks since they'd lowered her grandfather into the rocky soil of Pinecrest Cemetery, next to the brother he'd served with in Korea. The service had been small, just Tansy, the Methodist minister, and 2 old-timers from the Veterans of Foreign Wars post, who'd known Samuel from the monthly card games he attended until his health failed. Samuel had raised her after her parents died when she was 7. That much had always been clear and simple in Tansy's mind. Her father, Michael, and mother, Dorothy, had been killed in a car accident on Highway 89, their sedan crushed by a logging truck that jackknifed on black ice. One moment Tansy had parents, the next she had only Samuel, her father's father. A lean and weathered man who smelled of wood smoke and spoke in sentences as spare as winter branches. He'd been 62 then, the same age Tansy was now. The symmetry of it struck her as she navigated a particularly rough section of road. Samuel had taken in a grieving 7-year-old girl and raised her without complaint, teaching her to read animal tracks and identify edible plants, to move quietly through the forest and respect the wildness that could kill the careless or unprepared. She'd loved him in the way children love their protectors, completely and without question. He'd been gruff but never cruel, silent but never absent. When she skinned her knee, he cleaned and bandaged it without fuss. When she cried for her mother, he sat beside her and let her cry, his big hand resting gently on her shoulder until the storm passed. By the time Tansy graduated high school, she knew she wanted to follow Samuel's path into the wilderness. She studied forest management at the State University, then joined the Forest Service as a ranger. For 34 years, she'd patrolled these mountains, educated hikers about leave-no-trace principles, coordinated search and rescue operations, and fought wildfires that turned summer skies orange and filled valleys with smoke thick as fog. She'd met Tom Brennan during a training exercise in 1982. He was a ranger too, stationed 2 districts over, with an easy laugh and steady hands that knew how to splice rope and set broken bones. They married the following spring in a meadow overlooking the Clearwater River, with Samuel standing quietly in the back row, his face weathered and unreadable as always. Tom died 8 years ago on what should have been an ordinary patrol. He'd been checking a remote trail after spring runoff when the bank gave way beneath him. The fall itself hadn't killed him. It was the cold water of snowmelt and the hour it took for help to arrive. Hypothermia had claimed him before the helicopter reached the hospital. Tansy had continued working for 2 more years after that, but her heart had gone out of it. The mountains that had always felt like home became places where people died despite your best efforts, where nature reminded you that it didn't care about your training, or your love, or your desperate need for 1 more minute with someone who was already gone. She retired at 56 and moved into a small house on the edge of Pinecrest, close enough to the national forest that she could hike into the backcountry when the walls started closing in. Samuel had still been alive then, though already slowing down. His 90th birthday had come and gone, and age was doing what war and wilderness never quite managed, wearing him down to something fragile. They'd had dinner together every Sunday at her place or his small apartment above the hardware store. He never talked much, but he listened when she did. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something sad and proud and distant all at once. When the cancer diagnosis came 6 months ago, Samuel had refused treatment. 86 years is enough, he'd told her in the oncologist's office, his voice steady and final. I've had my time. She'd wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words that would change his mind. Samuel Reddin had always known exactly what he wanted and possessed the will to see it through, even when what he wanted was to die on his own terms. He'd lasted longer than the doctors predicted, staying sharp and mobile until the final 2 weeks. Tansy had sat with him in hospice, reading aloud from the field guides he'd once used to teach her the names of trees and birds. He'd listened with his eyes closed, and once or twice she thought she saw him smile. The day before he died, he'd gripped her hand with surprising strength and said, "The cabin. You need to go to the cabin." "Which cabin, Samuel?" She'd leaned closer, trying to understand. "The old trapping cabin, up past Widow's Creek." His eyes had opened then, pale blue and urgent. "Promise me you'll go. Handle it yourself. Don't send anyone else." "I promise," she'd said, because what else could she say to a dying man? He'd relaxed after that, sinking back into the pillows. The next morning he was gone, slipping away in his sleep, like a man simply deciding not to wake up. The lawyer had mentioned the cabin in Samuel's will. It was one of the few properties he'd owned outright, a primitive structure he'd built in the 1950s, when trapping was still a viable way to make winter money. The will specified that Tansy should handle its disposition personally, that the contents were hers to keep or discard as she saw fit. She'd put it off for 3 weeks, dealing with paperwork and the small tasks of closing out a life. Samuel's apartment had been easy, sparse furnishings, a few boxes of military memorabilia, clothes that went to the church donation bin. Nothing unexpected, nothing that required more than an afternoon to sort through. But the cabin nagged at her. Samuel's urgency about it, his insistence that she go personally, suggested there was something there he wanted her to find. Or perhaps something he wanted kept private, even in death. The truck crested a final rise, and the forest opened into a small clearing. Tansy pulled to a stop and killed the engine. From here, she'd have to hike. The last 2 miles followed an old trail too narrow and overgrown for vehicles. She loaded a backpack with supplies, locked the truck, and started walking. The trail was exactly as she remembered from childhood, when Samuel had brought her up here a handful of times. He'd used the cabin as a base for his trap lines, she'd thought, though she'd never actually seen him trap anything. Mostly they'd just hiked, and he'd pointed out animal signs, teaching her to read the forest like text. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, throwing long shadows across the trail. A Clark's nutcracker scolded from a snag, and somewhere far off, a raven's call echoed against the mountain faces. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and the first hint of winter coming down from the high peaks. Tansy's breath steamed in the cold air as she climbed. Her legs remembered this rhythm, the steady uphill push, the way you had to pace yourself for the long haul. She'd been strong once, strong enough to carry a 60-pound pack all day without complaint. Now she felt every year in her knees and lower back, but she kept moving, because that's what you did in the mountains. You kept moving until you reached your destination or admitted defeat, and Samuel's daughter, granddaughter, she corrected herself automatically, didn't admit defeat. An hour's walking brought her to Widow's Creek, running high and clear with snowmelt from the peaks. She crossed on the log bridge Samuel had built decades ago, the wood silvered with age, but still solid. Another half hour, and the cabin came into view through the trees. It sat in a small clearing on a bench of land above a steep ravine. Log construction, single room with a covered porch and a stone chimney rising from one end. The roof was sheet metal, rusty but intact. A shed leaned against the back wall, probably housing tools or what remained of Samuel's old trapping gear. Tansy approached slowly, taking in details. No broken windows, no obvious damage from weather or animals. The door hung slightly ajar, which gave her pause. Had Samuel left it that way on his last visit? Had someone else been here? She pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The air should have been musty, thick with years of dust and the smell of mice and decay. Instead, it smelled almost fresh, as if someone had opened the windows recently to air the place out. Weak afternoon light filtered through the small windows, illuminating a single large room that served as living space, kitchen, and whatever else Samuel had needed. The walls were bare logs, chinked with mortar that had held remarkably well. Hunting rifles hung on pegs near the door, secured with chains and locks. Old trapping tools decorated the far wall, leg-hold traps that had been illegal for decades, stretching frames for pelts, knives with handles worn smooth from use. A stone fireplace dominated the right side of the room, its hearth swept clean. A small kitchen area occupied the left, a cast-iron sink with a hand pump, a propane camp stove, shelves lined with canned goods that looked old but unopened. And, in the center of the room, positioned with unmistakable deliberation, sat two tables covered with canvas tarps. The tables were wooden, rough-built but sturdy, each about 6 feet long. The canvas covering them was military surplus, the kind that didn't rot or tear easily. It had been secured carefully, tucked under and weighted at the corners. Tansy set her backpack down and circled the table slowly. Everything else in the cabin showed its age. The log walls darkened with decades of smoke and time, the floorboards worn smooth in pathways between door and fireplace and kitchen. But these tables, these covered shapes in the room's center, seemed deliberately preserved. Her unease grew as she completed her circuit. Samuel had been many things, trapper, soldier, guardian, but he'd never been one for ceremony or display. Yet these tables had been arranged like altars, like something meant to be discovered intact. She remembered his final words, "You need to go to the cabin, handle it yourself." Whatever lay beneath those canvas covers, Samuel had wanted her to find it alone. He'd orchestrated this moment from beyond the grave, and standing here in the fading afternoon light, with winter coming down from the high peaks, Tansy Reddin understood that her grandfather had left her more than an old cabin in the mountains. He'd left her a truth she didn't yet know she needed. She took a breath, steadied herself, and reached for the nearest canvas cover. Then she stopped, hand hovering over the fabric. Not yet. First she'd search the rest of the cabin, see what else Samuel had left behind. Build up her courage, perhaps, or simply delay the moment when everything she thought she knew might change. The small bedroom waited through a doorway to the left. Tansy turned toward it, leaving the covered tables behind for now. Two silent mysteries in the gathering dusk. The bedroom was small, barely large enough for the narrow cot pushed against one wall and a wooden chair that served as nightstand. The bed had been made with military precision, blanket pulled tight and tucked at the corners. A kerosene lamp sat on the chair alongside a box of matches in a waterproof container. Tansy opened the single drawer beneath the chair's seat. Inside lay a stack of letters bound with twine, their envelopes yellowed with age. She lifted them carefully, noting the postmarks, 1970s through early 1980s. All were addressed to Samuel Reddin, General Delivery, Pinecrest. The return addresses had been scratched out, rendered illegible by deliberate strokes of black ink. She untied the twine and opened the first letter. The handwriting was feminine, neat, and careful. The paper crackled as she unfolded it. "Dear Samuel," it began. "I received the photograph you sent. She's beautiful and she looks happy. That brings me more comfort than you might imagine. I know we made the right decision, even though some days the weight of it nearly crushes me. She's better off not knowing." "You did the right thing." Tansy frowned, reading the words again. She, better off not knowing what. She opened another letter, dated 2 years later. "The money arrived, as always. You're more faithful than I deserve. I think of you often, wonder if you're well, if the mountains are treating you kindly. I think of her too, every day. Does she still have my eyes? I suppose I'll never know for certain. Please don't stop sending the pictures. They're all I have." A cold understanding began forming in Tansy's mind, still vague but increasingly insistent. She set the letters aside and searched the rest of the bedroom. In a small trunk at the foot of the bed, she found more correspondence, newspaper clippings, and a manila envelope containing photographs. The first photo stopped her breath. It showed Samuel, much younger, maybe 30 years old, standing beside a woman Tansy didn't recognize. The woman was dark-haired and pretty, wearing a simple dress and smiling at the camera. In her arms she held an infant wrapped in a white blanket. They looked like a family. They looked happy. Tansy turned the photo over. On the back, in Samuel's handwriting, "Rose, Samuel, and Tansy. June 1960. The room tilted. Tansy sat down hard on the bed, photo trembling in her hands. Rose and Samuel and Tansy. A family photograph from 1960, 3 years before her parents Michael and Dorothy supposedly had her. No, she'd been born in 1960, she knew that much. Her birth certificate said so. She dug through the manila envelope with shaking hands, pulling out more photographs. Samuel holding an infant. The woman, Rose, sitting in a chair with the same baby. Samuel and Rose together, looking at each other with obvious affection. At the bottom of the envelope, she found documents in plastic sleeves, legal papers, official seals, the weight of bureaucracy preserved in fading ink. The first document was a birth certificate. Mother, Rose Talbot. Father, Samuel Reddin. Child, Tansy. Rose Reddin. Date of birth, June 15th, 1960. Not Michael Reddin, not Dorothy Reddin, Samuel Reddin. Tansy's hands went numb. She read the document 3 times, trying to make the words mean something other than what they clearly stated. Samuel wasn't her grandfather. He was her father, her biological father. Everything she knew about herself, about where she came from, who she was, all of it built on a lie. She found more documents beneath the birth certificate, adoption papers dated June 1983, the month after her 7th birthday, the month after Michael and Dorothy, Samuel's brother and sister-in-law, died in the car accident. But these papers told a different story. Michael and Dorothy had adopted her as an infant, not given birth to her. Samuel had relinquished custody to his brother and brother's wife, legally and formally, when Tansy was just weeks old. The people she'd called Mom and Dad, who she'd mourned and missed for 55 years, hadn't been her biological parents at all. They'd been her adoptive parents. And Samuel, stoic, silent Samuel, who she'd called Grandpa, had been her father all along. Tansy stood abruptly, the papers falling from her lap to scatter across the floor. She stumbled back into the main room, her mind reeling, unable to process what she'd just learned. The covered tables waited in the center of the room. She crossed to the nearest one and yanked the canvas away without hesitation this time, anger and confusion giving her hands a strength they hadn't possessed earlier. Beneath the canvas, the table surface was covered with documents, organized in clear plastic sleeves and arranged in careful rows. Birth certificates, legal papers, more photographs, bank statements, letters, an entire archive of a life she'd never known she'd lived. She pulled the canvas from the second table. More of the same, a methodical documentation of secrets kept for 6 decades. Tansy grabbed the nearest stack of documents and began reading by the last light coming through the windows. The story. emerged in fragments, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed. Rose Talbot, young, from a wealthy Seattle family. Samuel Reddin, trapper and Korean War veteran living in the mountains of Montana. They'd met, fallen in love, conceived a child out of wedlock in an era when such things brought shame and scandal. Rose's family had been horrified. Letters from her father, her sister, documented their fury and threats. She would be cut off, disowned, institutionalized if necessary. The baby would be taken and given to a proper family. Samuel had wanted to marry her, raise their daughter together. His letters pleaded and argued and promised, but Rose's family had resources and determination, and Rose herself had been young and frightened. A compromise had been reached. Samuel's brother Michael and wife Dorothy were struggling, childless. After years of trying, Dorothy's depression deepening with each failed pregnancy. If Michael and Dorothy adopted the baby, raised her as their own, everyone benefited. The child would have a stable home with two parents. Rose's family could avoid scandal. Samuel would know his daughter was safe and cared for. Rose would disappear. From the picture, return to Seattle, start her life over. Samuel would step back, become Uncle Samuel, no, Grandfather Samuel, that sounded better. Close enough to watch over his daughter, but distant enough to maintain the fiction. Money changed hands. Not for the baby. Samuel would never have sold his child, but as insurance, as guarantee of silence. Rose's family paid Samuel a monthly sum that he deposited into a trust fund for Tansy's future. The payments continued for years, documented in the bank statements spread across the table. Tansy sank into the chair by the fireplace, clutching a photograph of Samuel holding her as an infant. His face in the picture showed pure, uncomplicated joy. The afternoon light had faded to dusk. The cabin grew cold around her. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean, and somewhere distant a coyote called to the rising moon. Samuel wasn't her grandfather. Rose Talbot, whoever she was her mother, not Dorothy. Michael and Dorothy had loved her and raised her, but they'd been playing roles in a drama scripted by others. Her entire life, every memory, every assumption about who she was and where she came from, had been built on a carefully constructed lie. A lie maintained for 62 years. A lie Samuel carried to his grave, only releasing it now through this cabin full of hidden truths. Tansy sat in the gathering darkness, documents scattered around her feet, and tried to understand what it meant to discover you'd been living someone else's version of your life all along. The wind picked up outside, bringing with it the first flakes of snow. Through the window she could see them falling, white against the darkening sky. The road down would be treacherous soon, maybe impassable by morning. She was trapped here now, alone with ghosts and revelations, with no way out until the weather cleared. Tansy Reddin, she didn't even know if that was her real name anymore, lit the kerosene lamp and began reading through the papers in earnest, searching for answers in the archive of a father who'd hidden himself behind the mask of grandfather for her entire life. Night settled over the mountains, while Tansy built a fire in the stone hearth. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar tasks, crumpling newspaper for tinder, arranging kindling in a teepee, striking a match and coaxing flame to life. Samuel had taught her this, along with everything else she knew about surviving in wild places. Samuel, her father. The word felt strange, even thinking it. For 62 years he'd been Grandpa, a title that fit him like his worn flannel shirts and scuffed boots. Now she was supposed to reimagine him as something else entirely, someone who'd hidden his true relationship to her behind decades of careful deception. She fed larger pieces of wood to the fire and settled into the chair with the stack of documents. Outside, snow fell steadily, visible in the lamplight through the window. She was committed now, no leaving until the storm passed and the road became passable again. The adoption papers told a story she'd never questioned before. Michael and Dorothy Reddin had adopted Tansy Rose. The name matched her birth certificate in June 1963, when the baby was 3 years old. No, that couldn't be right. She checked the date again. June 1963. But she'd been born in 1960. Why had the adoption taken 3 years to finalize? She dug deeper into the papers and found the answer in a court document. The adoption had been delayed because Samuel had initially refused to sign away his parental rights. He'd kept Tansy for the first 3 years of her life, raising her himself in this very cabin during trapping season and in his small house in Pinecrest the rest of the year. A journal entry, loose among the papers, explained what changed his mind. March 1963. Mickey came to visit yesterday. Says Dorothy is getting worse. Won't eat, won't get out of bed. Doctor says if something doesn't change soon, she might need to be hospitalized. Mickey is desperate. I look at Tansy, 3 years old, now saying full sentences, singing songs I taught her, and I know I'm being selfish. She needs a mother. She needs a normal life, not a half-wild existence with an aging bachelor who doesn't know the first thing about raising a daughter. Mickey and Dorothy can give her what I can't, so I'll sign the papers. I'll become her grandfather instead of her father. It's what's best for her, even if it kills me. Tansy wiped her eyes, surprised to find them wet. She'd been crying without realizing it. More documents filled in the gaps. The legal transfer of custody. A new birth certificate issued, the one Tansy had always known, listing Michael and Dorothy as her parents. The original, listing Samuel and Rose, sealed in court records, buried as if it had never existed. Michael and Dorothy had moved to Pinecrest shortly after the adoption finalized, bringing 3-year-old Tansy to the mountain town where Samuel already lived. To outsiders, it must have looked simple. A brother moving closer to family, a young couple raising their daughter near her grandfather. No one knew the truth except those involved, and they'd kept the secret perfectly. Tansy found photographs from those early years. Herself as a toddler, holding Samuel's hand as they walked through forest. Her 4th birthday party, with Michael and Dorothy beaming over a cake, while Samuel stood in the background, his face neutral. Christmas mornings, summer picnics, ordinary. Moments of family life that now carried an extraordinary weight of hidden meaning. She remembered some of these occasions. Not clearly, memory from that age was fragmentary at best, but she had impressions of Samuel always being present, always there at the edges of her childhood. The letters from Rose painted a different picture of those years. Rose had written to Samuel regularly, asking for updates, for photographs, for any scrap of information about the daughter she'd given up. Samuel had responded, though his letters, copies of which he'd kept, were brief and factual. Tansy is healthy. Tansy started school. Tansy lost her first tooth. Rose's letters grew more emotional over time. She'd married someone else in 1967, had 2 more children, a daughter in 1968, a son in 1970. But she never forgot Tansy, never stopped asking about her first child. I think about her every day, Rose wrote in 1975. Jennifer and David are wonderful, and I love them completely, but there's always this hollow space where Tansy should be. I made my choice 15 years ago, and I know it was the right one for that time, for that situation. But that doesn't make it easier. Does she ever ask about me? Does she wonder where she came from? Samuel's response, she thinks Dorothy is her mother. She's happy, healthy, doing well in school. She doesn't ask questions because she doesn't know there are questions to ask. Tansy set the letters aside and stood, needing to move. She paced the cabin's main room, processing the magnitude of what she'd learned. Samuel had been her father for 3 years before becoming her grandfather. She'd lived with him as an infant and toddler, learning to walk and talk in this cabin and in his house in town. Then he'd given her to his brother and disappeared into the background of her life, watching her grow up from a distance, unable to claim her as his own. The sacrifice of it staggered her. He'd loved her enough to let her go, to let someone else be her father, so she could have what he thought was a better life. And then Michael and Dorothy had died when she was 7, returning her to Samuel's care. But by then, the fiction was established, the roles set. He was grandpa, That's all he could ever be. She found Michael's military records among the papers. He and Samuel had served together in Korea, part of the same infantry unit. They'd survived combat together, saved each other's lives according to the commendations and letters from fellow soldiers. That bond, forged in war, tested by fire, must have made Samuel's decision both easier and harder. He'd trusted his brother with his life. Could he not trust him with his daughter? A photograph caught her attention. Samuel and Michael in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. On the back, Sam and Mickey, Seoul, 1951. Brothers, partners, friends. The bond between them had been strong enough that Samuel could bear to watch Michael raise his daughter. Strong enough that Michael could accept the responsibility, knowing what he was taking from his brother. Dorothy's struggle with infertility was documented in medical records Samuel had somehow obtained. Multiple miscarriages, failed treatments, the depression that followed. Letters from Michael to Samuel during the late 1950s painted a picture of a marriage in crisis, a woman losing hope of ever becoming a mother. Samuel's solution had saved her in a way, given Dorothy the child she desperately wanted, given Michael the chance to be a father, given Tansy a stable home with two parents instead of one aging bachelor. But the cost of it. Tansy returned to the chair and picked up a small leather journal she'd noticed earlier. Samuel's handwriting filled the pages, entries dating from 1960 through just a few months before his death. She opened to the first page. June 15th, 1960. Tansy Rose was born today at 6:23 a.m., 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Perfect. Rose held her for an hour, crying the whole time. Her family is already pressuring her to give the baby up, but I convinced her to wait, to think it through. I held my daughter this afternoon. She looked at me, and I swear she knew me. I'm her father. Whatever happens, I'm her father. Tansy. Read through the night, feeding the fire when it burned low, watching snow fall outside the window. The journal chronicled Samuel's internal struggle, his desire to keep his daughter, his fear that he couldn't provide what she needed, his eventual acceptance that letting her go was the most loving thing he could do. By the time pale light began, showing in the eastern sky, Tansy had read through 3 years of entries. The final one before the adoption was brief. June 1963. I signed the papers today. Tansy is officially Michael and Dorothy's daughter now. She'll call them Mum and Dad. She'll call me Grandpa. I'm doing the right thing. I have to believe I'm doing the right thing. But God, it hurts. The fire had burned down to embers. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world covered in fresh snow. Tansy closed the journal and sat in silence, trying to reconcile the Samuel she'd known with the man revealed in these pages. A man capable of enormous love and equally enormous sacrifice. Morning light revealed the full extent of the snowfall, 6 inches at least, maybe more in the drifts. Tansy stood on the porch, coffee mug warming her hands, and studied the white landscape. The trail down would be passable but challenging. She could leave today if she wanted to, but she wasn't ready. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many documents still unread. She went back inside and continued her systematic exploration of Samuel's archive. A calendar hung on the wall near the fireplace, marked with a single date circled in red, June 15th, repeated year after year. Her birthday. Samuel had come to this cabin every year on her birthday, she realized. A pilgrimage to remember who he really was, who she really was. For one day before returning to the comfortable fiction of their everyday lives. The last marked date was June 15th, 2023, 2 years ago. Samuel had been 84 then, his health already declining. But he'd still made the difficult hike up here, still kept his annual vigil. Among Rose's letters, Tansy found one that stood out from the rest. The envelope was sealed, never opened, with Samuel's handwriting across the front. For Tansy, when she's ready. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated January 1995. Rose's handwriting, shaky in places. Dear Tansy, if you're reading this, Samuel finally found the courage I never had. I'm writing this from the hospital, where they tell me I have maybe a few weeks left. Cancer has a way of clarifying what matters and what doesn't. What matters is this: I'm your mother, and I gave you away. I was 20 years old, terrified, and under pressure from a family that valued reputation over everything else. That's an explanation, not an excuse. I thought I was doing what was best for you. In 1960, an unwed mother faced impossible challenges, especially one from my background. My family threatened to have me committed, to take you away and give you to strangers. Samuel's solution, giving you to his brother, seemed like the least bad option. You'd be with family, safe, loved. I could know you were okay. Samuel could stay in your life, even if not as your father. I've thought about you every single day since. Samuel sends me photographs occasionally, and I've watched you grow into a strong, capable woman. You became a forest ranger like your father. You married well, from what Samuel tells me. You made a life in those mountains that shaped him. I wish I could have known you. I wish I could have been brave enough to fight for you, instead of letting fear and my family's expectations dictate my choices. But I can't change the past. I can only tell you this: you were wanted. You were loved. The decision to give you up nearly destroyed me, but I made it because I truly believed you deserved better than what I could provide at 20 years old. I hope you can understand, even if you can't forgive. You are your father's daughter, brave, silent, and strong. Samuel is one of the best men I've ever known, and the fact that he raised you, even from a distance, means you were never truly without him. I'm sorry I won't meet you. I'm sorry for so much, but I'm grateful you exist. With love, Rose. The letter was dated January 20th, 1995. Tansy found Rose's death certificate in the same envelope. She died December 8th, 1994. She'd written the letter during her final illness, then mailed it to Samuel with instructions he'd apparently never followed through on, or perhaps he'd tried. 1995, Tansy would have been 35 then, married to Tom, working as a ranger. Maybe Samuel had carried this letter around for weeks, looking for the right moment to give it to her, and never found it. Or maybe he'd simply lost his nerve. The letter raised more questions. Rose had mentioned other children, Jennifer and David. Tansy had half-siblings somewhere, people who shared her blood, but didn't know she existed. She found more information about Rose in the documents. After giving up Tansy, Rose had returned to Seattle and finished college. She'd become an elementary school teacher. In 1967, she married Robert Chen, a fellow teacher. They'd had 2 children together and lived, from all appearances, a normal, happy life. Rose never told her other children about Tansy. Samuel's letters confirmed it. Rose says Jennifer and David don't know about you. She worries about disrupting their lives with the truth. I understand that worry. I live it every day. Among the photographs, Tansy found pictures of Rose's family. Rose with her husband and 2 young children. Rose at their high school graduations, their weddings. Jennifer looked like Rose, same dark hair, same delicate features. David had their father's build, but Rose's smile. They were Tansy's family, people who shared her mother, and they had no idea she existed. She found Rose's obituary from a Seattle newspaper. Rose Talbot Chen, beloved wife, mother, and teacher, passed away peacefully after a long battle with cancer. She's survived by her husband, Robert Chen, daughter Jennifer Talbot Morrison, son David Talbot, and 4 grandchildren. No mention of a first child given up for adoption. No acknowledgement of the daughter Rose thought about every day. Tansy set the obituary down and stared at the fire. Her mother, her biological mother, had died 30 years ago. There was no possibility of meeting her, of asking questions, of understanding from Rose's own mouth why she'd made the choices she made. All Tansy had were these letters. This final note, written in a hospital room by a woman who knew she was dying. The question of what to do about Jennifer and David weighed on her. Should she contact them? Tell them they had an older half-sister? Or should she let sleeping dogs lie, preserve their memories of their mother without complicating them with difficult truths? Samuel's journal offered no guidance. He'd struggled with the same question during Rose's lifetime, but never acted on it. "It's not my place," he'd written. Rose made her choice. I made mine. Tansy deserves to know the truth, but Jennifer and David deserve their peace. I don't know how to balance those needs. Now the choice had fallen to Tansy. She spent the rest of the morning organizing the documents, creating stacks of what mattered most. Birth certificates, the adoption papers, Rose's final letter, selected photographs that showed the progression of her early life with Samuel, then with Michael and Dorothy. Samuel's journals deserved careful reading. She'd only skimmed them during the night, looking for immediate answers. But they contained his innermost thoughts across 60 years, his private reckoning with the choices he'd made. She found entries from her childhood, Samuel's observations about her personality, her interests, her challenges. He'd documented her life with the attention of someone who couldn't risk forgetting a single detail. July 1972. Tansy skinned her knee pretty badly today, fell off her bike on the gravel road. Dorothy wanted to baby her, but Tansy wouldn't have it. She cleaned it herself and put on the bandage, said she was fine. 12 years old and tougher than most adults I know. She's like me that way, independent to a fault. I worry that we, Michael, Dorothy and I, have raised her to be too self-sufficient, too used to handling things alone. But maybe that's exactly what she needs to survive in this world. Entry after entry revealed a father watching his daughter grow up while pretending to be someone else. The love came through in every word, as did the pain of maintaining that distance. Tansy found entries about Tom, about her wedding day. August 1983. Tansy married Tom Brennan today. Good man, steady, loves her the way she deserves. Michael walked her down the aisle. I stood in back and watched my daughter marry, and nobody knew what I was really feeling. This is my punishment for the choices I made, to love her completely while remaining forever peripheral to her life. The entry from after Tom's death was brief and devastating. April 2015. Tom died yesterday. Tansy called me at midnight, voice broken. I drove to her cabin and held her while she cried. She said, "Don't leave me, Grandpa. You're all I have." I promised I wouldn't, but I'm old. Someday soon she'll be alone, and it will be my fault. I gave her away once to give her a better life. Now that life has brought her back to solitude, and I have no way to fix it. By afternoon, Tansy had sorted through most of the first table's contents. The second table still waited, its canvas cover intact. She'd avoided it so far, overwhelmed by what the first table had revealed. But she couldn't leave without seeing everything Samuel had left for her. She pulled the cover away and began examining the second table's contents. More photographs, more letters, more documentation of a hidden life. But something caught her attention. A document she hadn't expected to see. A death certificate for an infant, baby boy Reddin, born August 15th, 1958, died August 18th, 1958. Parents listed Rose Talbot and Samuel Reddin. Tansy's hands began to shake. She had an older brother, a baby who'd lived only 3 days. The second day in the cabin passed in a blur of discovery and grief. Tansy sat at the table, surrounded by documents about a brother she'd never known existed, and tried to process yet another layer of her family's hidden history. The baby had been born in Seattle. At a hospital Rose's family must have chosen to keep things quiet. Hospital records, Samuel had somehow obtained copies, showed that the infant had severe heart defects. He'd undergone surgery at 2 days old, a desperate attempt to save his life. It hadn't worked. Photographs showed Samuel holding a tiny bundle in the hospital, his face haggard with exhaustion and grief. Rose in a hospital bed looking devastated. One photo of them together with the baby, a family of 3 for 3 brief days. The death certificate listed cause as congenital heart failure. Burial location, Cedar Hill Cemetery, outside Seattle. A grave marker paid for by Rose's family, though they'd apparently refused to attend the service. Just Samuel and Rose saying goodbye to their son. Letters between Samuel and Rose after the baby's death painted a picture of 2 people destroyed by grief. Rose blamed herself, blamed God, blamed the universe for taking their child. Samuel tried to comfort her, but his own pain came through in every word. September 1958. Dear Rose, I know you're hurting. I am too, but we can't let this break us. We loved him for the time we had. "That has to mean something," Rose's response. "I can't do this again, Samuel. My family says this was God's punishment for our sin. I don't believe that, but I can't risk another pregnancy, another loss. We're done. We have to be done." A gap in the correspondence followed, 6 months of silence. Then a letter from Rose in March 1959. "I've been thinking. Maybe you were right. Maybe we deserve another chance. Life is short and grief is heavy, but love is worth the risk. If you're willing, I'd like to try again." They'd reconnected during the summer of 1959. The letters became hopeful again, planning for a future together, despite Rose's family's continued disapproval. Samuel proposed to her at an alpine lake in the mountains, a place he'd marked on his maps with a red X. Then Rose got pregnant with Tansy, and her family's reaction this time was even more extreme. Letters from Rose's father and sister revealed their fury. "You've embarrassed us once, brought shame to our name with that illegitimate baby who mercifully died. We won't allow it again. Either you end this relationship and give up the baby for adoption to a proper family, or we'll have you committed and take the baby by force." The threat of institutionalization was real in 1960. Wealthy families had the resources and connections to have troublesome daughters declared mentally unfit and committed to asylums. Rose's family made it clear they would use every tool available to separate her from Samuel and control what happened to the baby. Samuel's letters from that period showed his rage and frustration. He'd wanted to fight, to marry Rose and face down her family together. But Rose was terrified, and Samuel eventually realized that a legal battle against a wealthy, connected family would likely result in losing both Rose and the baby. The compromise, giving Tansy to Michael and Dorothy, must have seemed like the only solution that kept everyone safe. Rose's family couldn't claim scandal if the baby disappeared into adoption with a respectable family. Samuel could ensure his daughter was raised by people he trusted. Rose could avoid institutionalization and know her child was safe. Tansy found a document she hadn't seen on the first table, a legal agreement signed by Rose's family, Samuel, and Michael. It stipulated that Tansy would be raised as Michael and Dorothy's daughter, that Samuel's paternity would never be publicly revealed, and that Rose would receive photographs and brief updates, but have no direct contact. In exchange, Rose's family would pay Samuel a monthly sum, not as payment for the baby, but as a trust fund for Tansy's future. The payments continued until Tansy turned 19, documented in decades of bank statements. Samuel had never touched that money except to invest it carefully. It had grown over the years, and when he died, it became part of Tansy's inheritance. She'd thought it was simply savings her grandfather had accumulated. Now she understood it was blood money, in a sense, payment from Rose's family to ensure silence and compliance. But Samuel had turned it into something else. He'd transformed his family's attempts to buy his daughter into a nest egg that would provide for her. Even in accepting their terms, he'd found a way to protect her. Tansy discovered more about the brother she'd never known. Samuel had kept the tiny hospital bracelet, a few wisps of hair, and a single footprint the hospital had made. These items were preserved in a small box with a note in Samuel's handwriting, "My son." I held him and sang to him and told him about the mountains he'd never see. He died in my arms while Rose slept, too sedated from grief to be there. I promised him I'd protect any siblings he might have. I failed him by letting him die. I wouldn't fail the next one. That promise, made to a dying infant, had shaped every choice Samuel made afterward. His decision to give Tansy to Michael and Dorothy wasn't just about providing her with two parents. It was about protecting her from the forces that he feared might harm her. The way he hadn't been able to protect his son from a heart defect, no one could have prevented. Tansy sat back and looked around the cabin with new understanding. This wasn't just a place where Samuel came to remember. It was a shrine to his children, the son who died and the daughter he'd given away. Both losses, both carried in silence for decades. She found Samuel's military decorations in a small wooden box. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Korean Service Medal. The citation for the Bronze Star described how Samuel had placed himself between enemy fire and wounded soldiers during an ambush, sustaining injuries himself but saving 3 men's lives. One of those men had been Michael. The citation didn't name the rescued soldiers, but letters from Michael confirmed it. "You saved my life that day, Sam. I'll never forget it. If there's ever anything I can do to repay you, anything at all, you just say the word." Years later, Samuel had asked Michael to raise his daughter. Michael had agreed without hesitation, repaying the debt of a life saved with the gift of fatherhood. The complexity of it all overwhelmed Tansy. Samuel hadn't just given her away carelessly. He'd orchestrated an arrangement that kept her safe from Rose's family, provided her with 2 loving parents, and allowed him to remain in her life even if he couldn't claim his true role. He'd sacrificed his own fatherhood for her well-being, just as he'd risked his life for his brothers in combat. Sacrifice seemed to be Samuel's defining characteristic, putting others first, even at tremendous cost to himself. Tansy found later journal entries from the years after Michael and Dorothy died. Samuel's anguish at watching 7-year-old Tansy grieve for her parents came through in every word. July 1990. Tansy crawled into my lap today crying for her mama. She's 7 years old, and she's lost everyone except me. I held my daughter and couldn't tell her I'm her papa. I wanted to say, "I'm here, I'm your father, you're not alone," but I couldn't. The lie is too established now. Michael and Dorothy are her parents in every way that matters. I'm just Grandpa. This is my punishment for the choices I made, and I accept it. But God, it hurts to watch her suffer and not be able to claim her. The entries continued through Tansy's teenage years, documenting Samuel's pride in her strength and independence, his worry about the solitary path she seemed drawn to. He recognized himself in her, the preference for wilderness over crowds, the comfort with silence, the fierce self-reliance that could become isolation if taken too far. When Tansy announced she wanted to become a forest ranger, Samuel's journal entry revealed both joy and concern. "She's following in my footsteps without even knowing it. The mountains call to her the same way they called to me. I'm proud of her, but I worry. It's a hard life, dangerous sometimes. But I can't tell her not to follow her heart. I never could." The entry from Tansy's wedding day brought tears to her eyes again. August 1983. Watched my daughter marry today. Tom is a good man, steady and kind. He'll take care of her the way I couldn't. Michael walked her down the aisle, because that's how it should be. Michael earned that right by being her father for 20 years. I stood in back and remembered the day she was born, remembered holding her as an infant, and I was grateful. Grateful she had Michael and Dorothy. Grateful she has Tom now. Grateful she'll never be as alone as I've been. My choices gave her that, even if they cost me everything. The most recent entries from the final years of Samuel's life showed him preparing for this moment. He'd known the cancer was terminal, known he had limited time. He'd spent his last months organizing this archive, making sure everything Tansy would need to understand her history was preserved and accessible. December 2024. Doctor says I have maybe 6 months. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of Tansy learning the truth without context, without understanding why we did what we did. So I'm writing this all down, organizing everything. The cabin will be my confession. She'll go there after I'm gone. I've made sure of that in the will. She'll find everything, and maybe she'll understand. Or maybe she'll hate me. I can accept that. What I can't accept is her never knowing who she really is, where she really came from. She deserves the truth, even if it comes too late. Tansy closed the journal and stood, needing to move. She stepped out onto the porch into the cold afternoon air. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clearing. She could leave tomorrow if she wanted. The road would be passable by then, but she wasn't ready to leave yet. There was more to discover, more to understand, and part of her wasn't ready to return to her normal life, to face what came next, with this knowledge weighing on her. The third morning dawned clear and cold. Tansy woke on the narrow cot in the bedroom, stiff from sleeping on the thin mattress, but oddly rested. She'd slept deeply for the first time since entering the cabin, as if some part of her had finally accepted the truth and could let go enough to rest. She made coffee on the propane stove and returned to the documents. Among Samuel's maps, she found one that was different from his usual practical trail charts. This one was personal, annotated with memories and significant locations. The ridge where he and Michael had camped on their way home from the war, spring of 1952. The meadow where he'd taught 7-year-old Tansy to fish, summer of 1967. The tree where he'd shot his first elk, autumn of 1948. Each location marked and dated. A geography of Samuel's life laid out in careful detail. One spot was marked with a red X and the notation, "Where I proposed to Rose, May 1960. The location was an alpine lake about 3 miles from the cabin, accessible in summer but deadly in winter. Tansy studied the map, trying to picture it. Samuel and Rose, young and in love, believing they could build a life together, despite her family's opposition. She found more letters from that brief period when they tried to make it work. Rose's letters showed genuine affection for Samuel, appreciation for his quiet strength and honesty. "You're so different from the men my family wants me to marry," she wrote in April 1960. "They're all about appearances and connections, saying the right things to the right people. You're real, Samuel. What you say, you mean. What you promise, you do. I love that about you." Samuel's letters to Rose were less flowery, but no less heartfelt. "I don't have much to offer you, except these mountains and my word. But my word is good, Rose. I'll take care of you and our baby. We'll make it work somehow." But somehow hadn't been enough against the combined weight of Rose's family's disapproval, social stigma, and the grief they both still carried from losing their first child. Tansy found a photo album she'd missed earlier, hidden in a trunk beneath old clothes. The first year of her life, documented by Samuel in careful detail. He'd been present for everything. Her first smile, first tooth, first steps. The photographs showed him holding her, feeding her, teaching her to touch pine cones and smell wildflowers. These weren't the photos of a distant grandfather. These were photos of a father completely absorbed in his daughter's existence. The transformation was visible in the later photos. By the time Tansy was 3, Samuel's presence in the pictures had changed. He stood farther back, his expressions more guarded. The shift marked the point where he'd signed the adoption papers and accepted his new role. The final photo in the album showed Samuel handing toddler Tansy to Dorothy. The expression on his face, captured by whoever had taken the picture, probably Michael, was one of absolute devastation held barely in check. Tansy had to set the album down and walk away. The cabin felt too small suddenly, too full of ghosts and grief. She grabbed her coat and went outside, following a deer trail into the forest. The snow was deep enough to make walking difficult, but she pushed through it, needing the physical exertion to ground herself. After 20 minutes, she reached a small clearing and stopped, breathing hard. Everything she'd thought she knew about herself had been revealed as fiction. Her parents weren't her parents. Her grandfather was her father. She had a mother she'd never met who died 30 years ago. She had siblings who didn't know she existed. She'd had a brother who died as an infant, shaping everything that came after. Her entire identity had been constructed by other people, well-meaning people perhaps, but people who decided that comfortable lies served everyone better than difficult truths. Tansy felt anger rising for the first time since finding the documents. Not the confused hurt of the first night, but genuine rage at the deception. Samuel and Rose and Michael and Dorothy, all of them had agreed to keep her in the dark. They'd made choices about her life without her input, without her consent. She was 62 years old and just now learning who her parents were. 62 years of living a lie because a group of adults in 1960 had decided that's what was best. But even as the anger flared, understanding tempered it. They'd been products of their time, facing circumstances that didn't have easy answers. An unwed mother in 1960 faced genuine hardship. Rose's family's threats of institutionalization hadn't been empty, such. Things happened to difficult women with alarming regularity. Samuel had done what he thought would keep his daughter safe and give her the best life possible. He'd sacrificed his own desires for what he believed was her welfare. Was that love or cowardice? Tansy couldn't decide. She returned to the cabin as the sun reached its zenith. Inside, she made a simple lunch from the supplies she'd brought and sat at the table with Samuel's final journals. The last entries, written in the months before his death, showed him wrestling with whether he'd made the right choices. I'll never know if giving Tansy to Michael and Dorothy was the right thing to do. She had a good childhood by all accounts. Michael and Dorothy loved her. But would she have been happy with just me? Could I have given her what she needed? These questions haunt me, but the time for different choices has long passed. All I can do now is make sure she knows the truth before I die. She deserves that much. But Samuel hadn't told her the truth before dying. He'd left it here in the cabin, arranged like evidence in a case she'd have to solve herself. Tansy found his will among the papers, the original document with his signature. He'd updated it 6 months before his death, adding a specific clause about the cabin. To my daughter, Tansy Reddin, I leave the cabin on Widow's Creek and all its contents. She will understand when she sees it. The lawyer who read the will must have known there were secrets here. Samuel had probably instructed him to emphasize that Tansy needed to handle the cabin personally, that she shouldn't send anyone else to clean it out. Samuel had orchestrated this revelation from beyond the grave, controlling the narrative even in death. Tansy wasn't sure if that showed courage or just another form of avoidance, leaving her to discover the truth alone rather than facing her reaction to it. She found one more document that changed her understanding again, a letter from Samuel's doctor, dated 8 months before his death. The cancer diagnosis had come even earlier than she'd thought. Samuel had known he was dying for the better part of a year and had used that time to prepare this archive. But there was another medical document attached to the doctor's letter, test results showing that Samuel's cancer was likely caused by exposure to Agent Orange. During the Korean War, the military had used chemical defoliants extensively, and decades later, veterans were still suffering the consequences. Samuel had never mentioned his health problems beyond the cancer. Now Tansy understood he'd been dealing with the effects of his military service for years, perhaps decades. The man who'd raised her while battling his own demons, who'd sacrificed his claim to fatherhood while his body slowly failed him, sacrifice upon sacrifice. Pain layered on pain. Tansy sat in the quiet cabin as afternoon faded toward evening and felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there, but so was a growing comprehension of Samuel's impossible situation. He'd been a young man who'd lost his first child, whose second child's mother was being threatened with institutionalization, who'd seen friends die in war and knew how quickly life could end. He'd done what he thought would keep his daughter safe. Maybe it was the wrong choice. Maybe there had been better options if only he'd been brave enough to fight for them. But he'd acted out of love, not selfishness, and that had to count for something. She thought about Tom, about the years they'd had together before his death. Tom had known her as Tansy Reddin, granddaughter of Samuel, daughter of Michael and Dorothy. That's who she'd been to him, and their love had been built on that foundation. Would knowing the truth have changed anything between them? She didn't think so. But Samuel hadn't given her the chance to find out, to decide for herself whether the truth mattered. That's what hurt most, Tansy realized. Not the deception itself, but being denied agency in her own story. Every major decision about her identity had been made by others, and she'd lived 62 years without knowing that those decisions were even made. The 4th day began with Tansy finally approaching the second table's remaining contents. She'd been avoiding the deepest layer, sensing that something significant still waited to be discovered. The death certificate for her infant brother had been shocking, but she felt there was more, something Samuel had buried beneath everything else. She found it in a false bottom of the table, a shallow compartment she'd almost missed. Inside lay a manila folder marked simply 1958 in Samuel's handwriting. The folder contained hospital records more detailed than the ones she'd seen before. Labor and delivery notes for Rose Talbot, pediatric records for baby boy Reddin. And a document that made Tansy's blood run cold. A report from a hospital social worker. Patient is 19-year-old unmarried female from affluent Seattle family. Family wishes to keep birth private. Patient extremely distressed following infant's death. Father of baby present but family has forbidden contact. Family attorney requesting information about adoption services should patient make same mistake again. Recommend psychiatric evaluation for patient due to emotional instability and family concerns about future behavior. The date on the report was August 20th, 1958, 2 days after the baby died. Rose's family hadn't waited even a week after their grandson's death before taking steps to control her future. To ensure she couldn't embarrass them again, more documents showed the extent of their intervention. Letters from Rose's father to various attorneys, discussing options for managing Rose should she refuse to cooperate. The word institutionalization appeared repeatedly, always couched in clinical language about Rose's emotional fragility and need for professional care. They'd been preparing to have her committed if she continued her relationship with Samuel. A letter from Rose to Samuel, dated September 1958, revealed the pressure she was under. They're watching me constantly. My sister goes through my mail. My father has threatened to have me declared incompetent if I try to see you again. They say the baby's death was God's punishment for our sin, that if I don't learn from it, worse will follow. I'm so tired, Samuel. I can't fight them anymore. Samuel's response, passionate and angry. Don't listen to them, Rose. What happened to our son wasn't punishment. It was tragedy, but it wasn't our fault. We loved him. That's all that matters. If you want to fight, I'll fight with you. We can leave Seattle, start over somewhere they can't touch us, but Rose hadn't been able to fight. The grief of losing her first child, combined with her family's psychological warfare, had broken something in her. The 6-month gap in correspondence after that exchange marked her retreat from Samuel, her acceptance of her family's control. When they reconnected in 1959 and Rose became pregnant with Tansy, her family's reaction had been even more extreme. Letters revealed their fury. They'd thought they had Rose under control, thought she'd learned her lesson. A letter from Rose's sister to Samuel, dated January 1960, laid out their position with brutal clarity. You killed our nephew with your selfish pursuit of our sister. Rose nearly died of grief. Now you've trapped her again with another pregnancy. This ends now. Either you stay away from Rose and allow the baby to be adopted by a respectable family we choose, or we'll have Rose committed and take the baby by legal means. We have doctors who will testify to her mental instability. We have lawyers who will ensure you never see that child. Stay away or lose everything. Samuel's response to that letter showed restraint Tansy could barely comprehend. Instead of rage, he'd written a careful, measured reply proposing the compromise that eventually became reality. If Rose's family would allow the baby to be adopted by Samuel's brother, a war veteran with an honorable discharge, a stable marriage, and a desperate desire for children, everyone's concerns would be addressed. The baby would be with family, known and trusted. Rose could have updates and photographs. Her family could avoid scandal by having the baby disappear into adoption records. Samuel would step back, become peripheral rather than central to the child's life. Rose's family had agreed, but only after extracting every possible concession. The legal agreement Tansy had found earlier was accompanied by correspondence showing how extensively they'd negotiated. Samuel could never reveal his paternity publicly. Rose could have photos but no direct contact. If Samuel violated these terms, Rose's family retained the right to seek full custody and cut him out entirely. They'd held all the power, and they'd used it mercilessly. But the deepest revelation came in the folder's final pages, a psychiatric evaluation of Rose, conducted by a doctor her family had hired in December 1959. When Rose was 6 months pregnant with Tansy, the doctor's report concluded that Rose showed no signs of mental instability or incompetence. Patient is articulate, rational, and clear about her desires. She wishes to have her baby and marry the father. While patient's family expresses concern about her judgment, I find no clinical basis for declaring patient mentally unfit or in need of institutional care. An honest evaluation that didn't support Rose's family's agenda. Attached to it was a second evaluation, dated 2 weeks later by a different doctor, one who happened to sit on the board of a psychiatric hospital Rose's family donated to heavily. This report reached very different conclusions. Patient demonstrates poor judgment and emotional instability. Patient's attachment to unsuitable partner and refusal to consider family's guidance suggests underlying psychological issues requiring professional intervention. Recommend close monitoring and possible involuntary commitment if patient continues current behavior pattern. Rose's family had shopped for a diagnosis that would give them legal grounds to control her. Tansy sat back, feeling sick. This wasn't just about social stigma or family reputation. Rose's family had been willing to have her declared insane and institutionalized to maintain their control, to avoid embarrassment, to ensure their daughter made choices they approved of. In that context, Samuel's decision to compromise made terrible sense. Fighting Rose's family in court would have been futile. They had money, connections, and doctors willing to provide convenient diagnoses. Samuel would have lost, and Rose might have ended up in an institution while their baby was given to strangers. The arrangement with Michael and Dorothy had been the least bad option in an impossible situation. It kept Tansy with family, kept Rose out of an asylum, and gave Samuel some role in his daughter's life, even if he couldn't claim his true place. He'd been trying to protect both Rose and Tansy from people who saw them as problems to be managed rather than human beings with their own agency. Tansy found Samuel's journal entries from that period, written in the margins of old maps and on scraps of paper he'd saved. "I'm so angry I can barely see straight. They're threatening to lock Rose up, to take our baby and give her to strangers, all because we don't fit their idea of respectability. I want to fight. I want to take Rose and run so far they'll never find us. But Rose is scared, and she's right to be scared. They can do exactly what they're threatening. I've seen it happen to other women, other families. So I'll swallow my pride and my rage, and I'll accept their terms, and I'll spend the rest of my life watching my daughter grow up at a distance. At least she'll be safe. At least she'll be loved. That's what matters." The sacrifice Samuel had made took on new dimensions. He hadn't just given up fatherhood. He'd surrendered to people who'd threatened to institutionalize the woman he loved and steal his child. He'd accepted their terms to protect both Rose and Tansy from worse outcomes, and he'd carried that knowledge alone for 60 years, never telling Tansy what he'd saved her from, never asking for credit or understanding. Tansy found one final document in the false compartment, a newspaper clipping from 1985. Rose's father had died, and the obituary mentioned his philanthropic work, his business success, his position in Seattle society. A pillar of the community by all accounts. Samuel had kept the obituary and written across it in pencil, "The man who threatened to have Rose locked up died rich and respected. Nobody knows what he did to his own daughter. That's how the world works, I suppose." The bitterness in those words was unlike anything else Tansy had read in Samuel's writings. He'd been a man who accepted his circumstances with stoic grace, who rarely complained or expressed resentment. But this one moment of anger had been preserved, a glimpse of how deeply the injustice had wounded him. Tansy gathered all the documents and sat with them as the afternoon light faded. Her understanding of her own history had shifted again. This wasn't just a story about an unwed mother giving up a baby. It was a story about class and power, about wealthy people using the medical and legal systems to control a young woman's life. Rose hadn't freely chosen to give Tansy up. She'd been coerced, threatened with institutionalization, backed into a corner by people who should have protected her, but instead saw her as a liability to be managed, and Samuel had done the only thing he could think of to save them both. He'd agreed to disappear from Rose's life and become a shadow in his daughter's, accepting permanent exile as the price of keeping his family safe from Rose's family's cruelty. The truth was more complicated and more painful than Tansy had imagined. But it was also finally complete. The fifth day dawned clear, the weather finally breaking for good. Tansy stood on the porch and studied the trail down. She could leave today. The snow had settled enough that hiking out would be manageable, and her truck should start, despite sitting in the cold for days. But she wasn't ready. One piece remained missing, one final discovery that Samuel must have intended for her. She felt its absence like a gap in a story that needed completion. She returned to the tables and began searching more methodically, checking every corner and crevice. In a wooden box beneath the second table, she found what she'd been looking for, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The envelopes were addressed to Tansy in Samuel's handwriting, but none had ever been mailed. Dozens of them spanning decades. She untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, dated September 1967. Dear Tansy, today was your first day of school. Dorothy told me you cried when she left you at the classroom door, but by the time she picked you up, you were smiling and showing her the painting you made. I wanted to be there, to walk you to school and hold your hand and tell you that you're brave and strong. But I'm just Grandpa. I have to wait for the times when I'm invited, when it's appropriate for me to be there. You'll be fine, though. You're my daughter, even if you don't know it. You have my stubbornness and my independence. You'll do more than fine. Tansy's hands trembled as she opened letter after letter, following the chronology of her life as Samuel had experienced it, always watching, always loving, always unable to claim his true place. A letter from 1975, her 13th birthday. You're becoming a young woman. I see your mother in your face sometimes, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking hard about something. But you're tougher than Rose was, maybe tougher than me. The mountains have made you strong. I'm so proud of you, Tansy. I wish I could say that as your father instead of your grandfather. From 1978, her high school graduation. You're going to college in the fall, studying forest management. When you told me, I had to turn away so you wouldn't see my face. You're following my path without even knowing it. The mountains call to you the same way they called to me. Part of me wants you to see more of the world than these peaks and valleys, but most of me is just grateful that we love the same things. It makes me feel connected to you in a way I couldn't be otherwise. The letter from the day she brought Tom home to meet the family made Tansy pause. I met your young man today. Tom Brennan, he's a ranger like you, and he looks at you the way I used to look at Rose, like you're the sun, and he's grateful for the light. I played the gruff grandfather, asked him about his intentions, made him nervous the way I was supposed to. But inside I was screaming, take care of my daughter. Love her better than I could. Give her the life I couldn't give her mother. He will, I think. He's a good man. From her wedding day in 1983, you married Tom in the meadow today. It was beautiful. The mountains rising behind you, wildflowers everywhere, your face so happy I thought my heart would break. Michael walked you down the aisle because that's right, that's proper. He earned that privilege by being your father for 20 years. I stood in back and remembered the day you were born, and I was grateful. Grateful you had Michael and Dorothy. Grateful you have Tom now. Grateful you'll never be as alone as I've been. My choices gave you that, even if they cost me everything. After the ceremony, you hugged me and thanked me for teaching you to love wild places. If you only knew that every lesson was my way of being your father, the only way I had. The letters from the years of Tansy's marriage showed Samuel's contentment at seeing her happy. He wrote about visits where he'd seen her and Tom together, their obvious partnership and affection. He wrote about his relief that she'd found someone to share her life with. Then came the letter from 2015, written after Tom's death. I got the call at 3 a.m. Tom fell on patrol. They couldn't reach him in time. The hypothermia took him before the helicopter arrived. I drove to your cabin and you let me in without saying anything, and then you collapsed against me and sobbed. You gripped my shirt and said, "Don't leave me, Grandpa. You're all I have left." I promised I wouldn't leave you. I held my daughter while she cried for her husband, and I couldn't tell her what I was really feeling, that I'd failed her again. I gave her away so she'd have a family, 2 parents to protect her. They died. I let her marry so she'd have a partner to share her life with. He died, and now she's alone again like me, and it's my fault somehow. I set her on this path 60 years ago, and it led her here to this grief. I promised I wouldn't leave her, but I'm 76 years old. I won't be able to keep that promise much longer. Tansy had to stop reading, overwhelmed by the weight of Samuel's love and his misplaced guilt. He'd somehow convinced himself that he was responsible for every loss she'd suffered, every moment of pain in her life. She forced herself to continue. The more recent letters showed Samuel's awareness of his failing health, his knowledge that time was running out. A letter from 2 years ago. The cancer is spreading. Doctor says I should start treatment, but I'm 84 years old and tired. I've lived longer than I had any right to expect. I've watched my daughter grow into a strong, capable woman who can take care of herself. That's more than many fathers get. I'm going to use what time I have left to prepare for her to learn the truth. I'm organizing everything here at the cabin, all the documents, all the letters, all the evidence of who she really is. I can't tell her to her face. I'm a coward that way. But I can leave her everything she needs to understand. The final letter in the bundle was dated a week before Samuel died. My dearest Tansy, I'm out of time. The lawyer will read my will soon, and you'll come to the cabin like I asked. You'll find everything. All the secrets I couldn't speak, all the truths I was too afraid to tell you while I was alive. I know that makes me a coward. I know you deserve better than learning about your life from documents and old letters. But I couldn't find the courage to face you with this truth. I was afraid you'd hate me, afraid I'd lose the little bit of you I had. So I'm doing it this way after I'm gone, when your anger can't hurt me because I'm already beyond hurting. That's selfish, I know. But I've been selfish about you from the beginning. I kept you when I should have let you go to a better situation. Then I gave you away when maybe I should have fought harder to keep you. I've spent 60 years second-guessing every choice I made about your life. Were Michael and Dorothy better for you than I would have been alone? I think so. I hope so. They gave you stability, 2 parents, a normal childhood. I gave you mountains and silence and the knowledge of how to survive in wild places. Together, maybe we gave you enough. You grew up strong and independent and capable. You found love with Tom, even though you lost him too soon. You've lived a good life by most measures, but it was built on lies, and you deserve to know the truth. So here it is, all of it, everything I couldn't say while I was alive. I'm your father. Rose Talbot was your mother. We loved each other, and we loved you, but we couldn't find a way to be a family. Michael and Dorothy raised you because I thought it was best for you. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was wrong. But I did it because I loved you, Tansy. Every day of your life I loved you. Every moment I called you granddaughter when I meant daughter. Every time I taught you to track or identify plants or survive in the backcountry, I was trying to give you what I couldn't give myself, the strength to face hard truths and keep going. You have that strength. You've always had it. I gave you life twice, once when you were born, once when I let Michael and Dorothy adopt you. Now I'm giving you the truth, and I'm trusting you to know what to do with it. I don't ask for forgiveness because I don't know if I deserve it. I just ask that you remember this. You were loved, always, completely, impossibly loved by a man who couldn't figure out how to be your father, but never stopped being it in his heart. I'm sorry for the lies. I'm sorry for the confusion. I'm sorry I'm not brave enough to tell you this while looking at you. But I'm not sorry for loving you. That's the one thing I got right. Your father, Samuel. Tansy set the letter down with shaking hands. The sun had climbed high, illuminating dust motes in the cabin's still air. Outside, a raven called from somewhere in the trees. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains Samuel had loved, the wilderness he'd taught her to navigate and respect. Everything she knew about surviving in these places had come from him. Her father, not her grandfather. All those lessons had been his way of parenting her, of giving her skills that would keep her safe long after he was gone. She thought about the choices facing her now. Samuel had given her the truth, but he'd also given her a decision to make. She had half-siblings somewhere, Jennifer and David Talbot, Rose's other children. They didn't know she existed. Rose had apparently never told them about the baby she'd given up before they were born. Did Tansy have a right to disrupt their lives with this information, or an obligation to tell them they had an older sister? She found Rose's address book among the papers, a small, worn notebook with updates in different colored inks across the years. Rose had kept track of her family's addresses, phone numbers, major life events. Tansy's information was there too, updated whenever she moved. With notation of her marriage to Tom and later his death, Rose had tracked her first daughter's life from afar, never reaching out but never forgetting. Jennifer and David's current information was listed. Jennifer Talbot Morrison, attorney in Seattle. David Talbot, architect in Portland. Both successful, both with families of their own, judging from the notations about spouses and children, Tansy's half-siblings, living their lives without knowing she existed. She spent the rest of the day organizing documents, deciding what to take with her and what to leave. She couldn't carry everything, the archive was too extensive. But she could take the most important pieces. Birth certificates, Rose's final letter, Samuel's journal, the bundle of unsent letters he'd written to her across 60 years. As the sun set on her 5th day in the cabin, Tansy made her decision. She would take the documents home. She would process this truth in her own time, in her own way. And then she would decide whether to reach out to Jennifer and David, whether to introduce herself as the sister they'd never known they had. But first, she needed to leave this place, return to her life in Pinecrest, and figure out who Tansy Reddin was, now that she knew where she really came from. The hike down took 3 hours. Tansy moved carefully over snow-covered trail, her backpack heavy with documents and photographs. The physical exertion felt good after days of sitting and reading, of emotional turmoil with no outlet. Her truck started on the second try, engine reluctant in the cold, but ultimately cooperative. She drove down the mountain as afternoon shadows lengthened, watching the cabin disappear behind trees and ridges until it was gone completely. Back in Pinecrest, her small house felt different somehow. The same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, pictures of her with Samuel, with Tom, with the colleagues she'd worked with during her ranger years. But now she saw them all through the lens of what she'd learned. Every image of Samuel carried new weight. Every memory had been recontextualized. She spread the documents across her dining table and began sorting them methodically. What to keep close at hand, what to file away, what she might need if she decided to contact Jennifer and David. Rose's address book sat in the center of the table, open to the page with her half-siblings' information. Tansy stared at it for a long time, phone in her hand, finger hovering over the numbers. She could call right now. Introduce herself. Explain that their mother had a child before they were born, a daughter given up for adoption who'd just learned the truth. But what right did she have to disrupt their lives? They had their own memories of Rose, their own understanding of who their mother had been. Tansy would complicate that, force them to reconcile the mother they'd known with a woman who'd given away a baby under duress. She set the phone down and picked up Rose's final letter instead. Reading it again by lamplight. You are your father's daughter, brave, silent and strong. Was she? Or had she simply learned to survive alone because everyone she'd loved had either hidden themselves from her or died? The next morning, Tansy made a decision. She would write letters, not call. Letters would give Jennifer and David space to process, to decide whether they wanted contact. Less invasive than a phone call, more thoughtful than an email. She spent 2 days drafting and redrafting, trying to find words that would explain without demanding, that would offer connection without pressure. Dear Jennifer, the final version began. My name is Tansy Reddin. I'm writing to tell you something that will likely come as a shock. Your mother, Rose Talbot Chen, was also my mother. She gave birth to me in 1960, before you were born, and placed me for adoption with my father's brother. I only learned this truth recently after my father, Samuel Reddin, died and left me documents explaining our family's history. I don't know if your mother ever told you about me. From what I've learned, I believe she kept my existence private, perhaps to protect you from a complicated truth. I'm not reaching out with any expectations or demands. I simply wanted you to know that you have an older half-sister who would welcome the chance to know you if you're interested. I've enclosed copies of my birth certificate and a photograph of our mother with me as an infant. If you'd like to learn more, or if you'd prefer I not contact you again, please let me know. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Sincerely, Tansy Reddin. She wrote a similar letter to David, adjusting the tone slightly. From her research online, he seemed more informal, possibly more open to unexpected news. Both letters sat on her kitchen counter for 3 days while she debated mailing them. This was the moment of no return. Once she sent these letters, she couldn't take back the information, couldn't undo the disruption to Jennifer and David's understanding of their family history. But she thought about Samuel's final letter to her, about his regret at not being brave enough to tell her the truth face to face. She thought about Rose, tracking her daughter's life from a distance, but never reaching out. All that silence, all that distance, all those years of everyone protecting everyone else from difficult truths. Maybe it was time for honesty instead. Tansy drove to the post office and stood at the mailbox with both envelopes in her hand. A final moment of hesitation, of wondering if she was doing the right thing. Then she dropped them in and walked away before she could change her mind. The next 2 weeks passed in anxious waiting. Every time her phone rang, every time mail arrived, her heart jumped. But there was no response from Seattle or Portland, just silence. Maybe Jennifer and David had decided not to reply. Maybe they'd read the letters and wanted nothing to do with an unexpected half-sister. Maybe they thought she was a fraud, someone trying to insert herself into their family. Tansy tried to prepare herself for permanent silence, for the possibility that her half-siblings wanted nothing to do with her. Then, 17 days after mailing the letters, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Seattle area code. Tansy's hand trembled as she answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, cautious but not unfriendly. "Is this Tansy Reddin?" "Yes." A pause, then. "This is Jennifer. Jennifer Talbot Morrison. I got your letter." Tansy's throat went dry. She sat down at her kitchen table, phone gripped tight. "Thank you for calling." "I wasn't sure if you would." "I almost didn't," Jennifer said. "I've read your letter probably 20 times. I've verified the information you sent. Called the hospital where you said you were born, checked the records. It's all accurate. I wouldn't lie about something like this. I believe you." Jennifer's voice held a mixture of emotions Tansy couldn't quite pass. "After I got your letter, I went through my mother's things. She died in 1994, and my father kept some boxes of her personal items. I'd never gone through them carefully. There was a locked box, small, hidden at the back of a closet. Her wedding ring from my father, her second husband, was the key, literally. It fit the lock." Tansy waited, heart pounding. Inside were photographs of her with a man I didn't recognize, and with a baby. The photos were dated 1960. On the back of one, she'd written, "My first daughter." There were letters, too, from someone named Samuel, and one sealed envelope with my name on it, dated a week before she died. "What did it say?" Jennifer's voice caught slightly. "That she had a daughter before David and me. That she'd given you up for adoption because her family, our grandparents, threatened to have her institutionalized if she didn't. That she thought about you every day. That if you ever reached out, I should welcome you, because you deserve to know your siblings." Silence stretched between them. Then Jennifer continued, "She asked me to find you if you made contact. Said you deserved to know your family. I didn't know if I should reach out," Tansy said quietly. "I didn't want to disrupt your life." "You already have," Jennifer said, but there was a hint of warmth beneath the words. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe my mother carried this secret too long. Maybe we all did." They talked for an hour. Jennifer asked questions about Samuel, about how Tansy had learned the truth. Tansy explained about the cabin, the documents, the revelation that had upended everything she thought she knew about herself. Jennifer shared memories of Rose, a gentlewoman, a devoted teacher, someone who sometimes seemed sad in ways her children couldn't understand. She used to get quiet around mid-June every year. "Now I know why. Your birthday was June 15th, wasn't it?" "Yes." She was thinking of you. All those years, she was thinking of you. Before they ended the call, Jennifer suggested meeting in person. I'd like to see you. Talk face to face. David should be there too. He's traveling for work right now, but he'll be back next week. He's going to want to meet you. They settled on a date 3 weeks out at a cafe halfway between Seattle and Pinecrest. Neutral territory, public space, easy to leave if things became too uncomfortable. After hanging up, Tansy sat in her kitchen as evening darkened into night. She'd done it. She'd reached out and Jennifer had responded. She had a sister, half-sister technically, but the distinction seemed less important now. The next day, a package arrived. Inside was a photograph in a simple frame, Rose with 2 young children, a girl and a boy, Jennifer and David. On the back, Jennifer had written, "Your mother with your siblings. She loved us and she loved you. Maybe now we can all be family." Tansy placed the photograph on her mantel, next to the one of Samuel holding infant Tansy. Pieces of a family that had been separated by circumstance and fear, now being slowly reassembled across decades and distance. 2 weeks later, another call came, this time from David. His voice was warm, curious, less guarded than Jennifer's had been. "I can't believe I have an older sister. Jennifer told me everything. I've been looking at the photos she found. You look like Mom. Jennifer said you looked like her too. We all do, I guess. Dad, Robert, the man who raised us, used to say we got all our good looks from Mom." A pause. "I'm sorry you didn't get to know her. So am I. But you can know us if you want. Jennifer and I talked about it. We want to meet you, learn about you, figure out how to be siblings even though we're basically strangers." Tansy felt tears threatening. "I'd like that." The days until the meeting passed slowly. Tansy visited Samuel's grave, something she'd avoided since learning the truth. She stood before his headstone and spoke aloud for the first time. "I met Jennifer on the phone. She found Rose's letter. David called too. I'm going to meet them next week." She paused, then added, "I understand now, Dad, what you did, why you did it. I'm not sure I agree with all your choices, but I understand them. And I'm grateful for the life you gave me, for Michael and Dorothy, for the truth you left in that cabin. Thank you." The wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of coming spring. Tansy placed her hand on the cold stone and felt, for the first time since entering the cabin, a sense of peace beginning to take root. The cafe sat in a small town neither Tansy nor Jennifer called home, a deliberate choice that put them on equal footing. Tansy arrived 15 minutes early, nervous in a way she hadn't been since her first day as a ranger decades ago. She ordered coffee and took a corner table where she could watch the door. The cafe was quiet on a Wednesday afternoon. A few locals, a couple working on laptops. The gentle hum of conversation and espresso machines. Jennifer arrived exactly on time, recognizable immediately from the photos Tansy had studied. Dark hair like Rose's, professional bearing, eyes that assessed and measured. Behind her came a tall man with an easy smile, David. They stood for a moment, 3 strangers who shared blood and history, unsure how to bridge the gap between biology and connection. Then David stepped forward and offered his hand. "Tansy, it's good to finally meet you." His warmth broke the tension. Tansy shook his hand, then Jennifer's, and they sat together at the small table. For the first few minutes they spoke carefully, formally, but gradually the conversation found its rhythm. David asked about her work as a ranger, her years in the mountains. Jennifer wanted to know about Samuel, about the man who'd been their mother's first love. Tansy found herself telling stories she'd never shared with anyone, memories of Samuel teaching her to track deer, to identify plants, to move quietly through wilderness. She told them about finding the cabin, the documents, the slow revelation of a truth that had been hidden for 62 years. "He loved her," Tansy said, speaking of Samuel and Rose. "That much was clear in everything I found. But they couldn't find a way to make it work, not with her family's opposition and the times they lived in." Jennifer nodded. "I found letters from our grandfather, Rose's father. He was a hard man, concerned more with reputation than with his daughter's happiness. The threats he made were real. Samuel knew that, Tansy said. That's why he agreed to step back, to let his brother raise me. He was protecting Rose from being institutionalized. David leaned back in his chair. Our mother carried that guilt her whole life, I think. Jennifer and I were talking about it. All those times she seemed sad, especially around your birthday. We thought she was just moody sometimes. Now we understand. They talked for 3 hours, ordering food they barely touched, coffee that went cold as they shared stories and photographs. Jennifer had brought the pictures she'd found in Rose's locked box. David had tracked down information about Samuel's military service, wanting to understand the man who was Tansy's father. As the cafe began preparing to close, they stood reluctantly. This doesn't have to be the only time, Jennifer said. I mean, if you want to stay in touch. Get to know each other properly. I'd like that, Tansy said. David hugged her, easy and natural. You're our sister. That's not going to change. Jennifer's embrace was more reserved, but no less sincere. Mom would be glad we found each other. Tansy drove home as the sun set, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She wasn't alone. She had siblings, family who wanted to know her. Over the following months, they built a relationship slowly. Phone calls every few weeks. Texts sharing small moments of daily life. Jennifer sent photos of her children. Tansy's niece and nephew, she realized with wonder. David invited her to Portland to see his latest architectural project. Tansy showed them the cabin eventually, hiking up with Jennifer on a warm July day. They stood together in the space where Samuel had preserved the truth, and Jennifer cried quietly as she looked through the documents. He really loved her, Jennifer said, echoing Tansy's words from their first meeting. Yes, Tansy agreed, and she loved him. They found Samuel's maps, including the one marking where he'd proposed to Rose. The Alpine Lake was accessible in summer, a few miles from the cabin. On impulse, they hiked there together, following Samuel's hand-drawn route. The lake was exactly as beautiful as Tansy had imagined. Crystal clear water reflecting peaks and sky, wildflowers dotting the meadow around it. This was where Samuel and Rose had planned their future, where they'd believed love would be enough. It hadn't been. But that didn't make the love less real. Jennifer found a flat stone and set it at the water's edge. For Mom and Samuel, she said simply. Back in Pinecrest, Tansy continued her quiet life, but it felt different now. Less isolated, less defined by loss. She had family again, not the family she'd been born into, or the one that had raised her, but the one she'd found through truth and courage. She kept Samuel's compass on her mantle, next to the photographs of all the people who'd shaped her life. Michael and Dorothy, who'd raised her with love. Tom, who'd shared her best years. Samuel, who'd loved her from a distance. Rose, who'd never forgotten her first daughter. And now Jennifer and David, siblings she was still learning to know. One evening in late autumn, Tansy returned to Samuel's grave. Snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season. She placed her hand on his headstone, no longer cold with anger or confusion, just quiet acceptance. I found them, Dad, she said softly. Jennifer and David. We're family now, building something new from the pieces you left behind. I think you'd be pleased. She thought of the cabin waiting in the mountains, Samuel's confession preserved in logs and stone and carefully organized documents. She wouldn't return there often, but she was glad it existed, a testament to truths that had been hidden too long. The snow fell steadily, covering the ground in white. Tansy stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back to her truck. She had phone calls to make, plans to arrange. Jennifer wanted her to come to Seattle for Thanksgiving, to meet the whole family. Tansy Reddin, daughter of Samuel and Rose. Raised by Michael and Dorothy, widow of Tom, sister to Jennifer and David, had spent 62 years living a story someone else had written. Now, finally, she was writing her own ending, and it was enough.